Hi everyone, it's Yukimi. Thank you for joining me again. Last week in episode 1, I shared something I've kept quiet for most of my life, that I am a third generation Zainichi Korean. Many of you wrote afterwards saying, I had no idea about the existence or story of Zainichi Koreans. And I understand why. This history is not taught, and for a long time it wasn't openly discussed, even within our own community. A few of you also mentioned the novel Pachinko by Min-jin Lee. She's a Korean-American author, not Zainichi Korean. Quite frankly, I was gifted this book by one of my former clients when it first came out, but I still haven't read it, so I can't speak to how it portrays Zainichi life. I do, however, have thoughts about how Zainichi stories are represented in fiction and media, and I'll save those for future episodes. And if you read Pachinko, I would genuinely like to hear what you think. Maybe that will finally convince me to read it. So today, I want to take a few minutes to explain how all this began. Before I do, I want to be very clear. Everything I'm sharing here is grounded in fact. I'm not speaking from anger or blame or resentment toward any nation or people. I'm speaking simply as someone telling the truth of where I come from, a truth that has been buried for a long time. Let's go back to the late 19th century. People often point to the year 1910 as the moment everything started, because that's when Japan formally annexed Korea. But the groundwork was laid decades before. In 1876, Japan pushed Korea to open its ports under the Treaty of Ganhwa, a treaty that Korea didn't enter willingly. From there, Japan's presence grew steadily. After Japan defeated China in the 1890s and Russia in the early 1900s, its control over Korea deepened. By 1905, Korea was a protectorate, which basically meant Japan was running the major decisions even though Korea still existed on paper. So by the time 1910 arrived, annexation wasn't a shock or a sudden takeover. It was the moment Japan made official what had already been unfolding for years. Overnight, the Korean peninsula became part of the Japanese empire. And I want to emphasize this part because it's often misunderstood. Koreans didn't move to Japan the way we understand immigration today. We didn't migrate. Under colonization, Koreans were considered imperial subjects of Japan, not citizens, not foreigners, but something in between, absorbed into an empire they never asked to join. As Japan expanded and prepared for war in the 1930s and 40s, Korean labor was mobilized across factories, mines, shipyards, and construction sites. Some people left Korea because the economic conditions created by colonial rule made survival nearly impossible. Some were recruited. Many were pushed or forced. But none of this followed the logic of migration. It followed the logic of empire. This is how hundreds of thousands of Koreans ended up living across the Japanese islands before the war ended. Not as newcomers finding an opportunity, but as a colonized population whose movement was shaped entirely by a system they did not choose. Then 1945 arrived. Japan surrendered. The empire collapsed. But the people didn't disappear. The hundreds of thousands of Koreans living and working in Japan stayed right where they were. And suddenly, the category that defined them, imperial subjects, vanished. They weren't Japanese citizens. They weren't protected by either Korean state. They existed in Japan, but without any legal status. Japan was rebuilding itself as a homogeneous nation, a nation built on the idea of sameness. And in that vision, there was no clear place for a community brought into the country through the empire. No one, not Japan, not the occupying forces, not the newly forming governments in South or North Korea, knew exactly what to do with us. Everything crystallized in 1952 when the San Francisco Peace Treaty went into effect. Japan regained its sovereignty, and with one legal shift, Koreans in Japan lost the limited status they had under imperial rule. They did not become Japanese citizens. They did not automatically become citizens of South or North Korea. In a single moment, an entire community became officially stateless. My grandparents' generation lived through that. One day they were part of an empire, unequal, but recognized. The next day they belonged nowhere on paper. They lived in Japan, worked in Japan, paid taxes in Japan, raised children in Japan, yet legally they existed in a kind of void. This shaped everything that came after: identity, safety, silence, how we moved through the world. And the division of Korean Peninsula made it even more complicated. When South and North Korea split, that fracture didn't stay on the peninsula. It reached across the sea and reshaped how Zainichi Koreans imagined home, how we understood dignity, and how we carried our history inside a country that didn't see us. To give a clearer sense of what daily life looked like, here's one example of the practical challenges Zainichi Koreans often faced. For decades after the war, many of them faced restrictions in employment and were excluded from large areas of the formal workforce. Until the late 1990s, access to stable full-time jobs was limited due to legal status, required documentation, and widespread hiring discrimination. Building a stable life in those conditions was structurally difficult, not due to a lack of ability, but because the systems in place did not allow equal participation. This is what makes the Zainichi story so unique. It's not a story of immigration. It's not a refugee story. It's not a simple diaspora. It's a community shaped by loss, rupture, decades of adaptation, and long stretches of oblivion, abandonment, and erasure. And there's another difficulty people rarely talk about: the assumptions others place on us. Some people insist we must be fully Korean. Others assume we are simply Japanese. Well, neither is true. And to make things even more complex, many Zainichi today choose to identify as fully Japanese, which adds another layer to how our identities are perceived and understood. We live in that in-between space, a space created by history, not by personal choice. And when I try to explain this, I sometimes struggle. I'll be honest, I'm still learning about my own ancestry through this project. I didn't grow up with access to this knowledge, so even though I feel the weight of it in my bones, I don't always have the perfect, polished language to express it, yet. But I am getting better at it, and I'll be even better in the next episode. I promise. There are also practical communication challenges. The complexity of this history doesn't always align with the simplified categories people expect, and explanations can be difficult when the broader public has limited awareness of the context. At times, people respond with assumptions or misunderstandings, including framing the background as something distant or unfamiliar. These reactions highlight the broader gap in public knowledge. The Zainichi Music Project exists to address that gap. It is not about eliciting sympathy or assigning blame. It is about presenting the historical record clearly and giving long overlooked experiences the recognition they deserve. This history also explains everything that comes next. The two names many of us were given at birth, the pressure to assimilate, the silent rules we learned to follow, and the statelessness that shaped entire generations. In the following episodes, I'll talk about what this history created in everyday life, who the Zainichi Koreans are today, why names, especially the two names so many of us carried, became such a defining part of our identity. Thank you for listening, and thank you for walking into this history with me. If you'd like to follow the project more closely, you can subscribe to the Zainichi Music Project on Substack or find us on Instagram or TikTok. And to those listening from my other podcast, The Piano Pod, thank you for supporting this new chapter. More soon.